I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where I'd have to call the police on my own HOA president, but here we are. My name is Raymond Brown, and I'm a 34-year-old IT security specialist who moved to Willowbrook Estates about 2 years ago, thinking I'd found the perfect quiet suburban neighborhood to settle down in. I work from home most days, which means I'm around to see all the neighborhood drama unfold. And trust me, there's been plenty of it since Karen Mitchell took over as HOA president 6 months ago. What I didn't expect was to walk out of my house one Saturday morning to find this woman literally selling my belongings at a yard sale in her own driveway. But that's exactly what happened. And when I confronted her about it, she had the audacity to call 911 and try to have me arrested for harassment. But here's what Karen didn't know about me. My background in cybersecurity means I'm pretty good at gathering evidence and documenting everything. And I have a very particular set of skills when it comes to dealing with people who think they can abuse their power. This story is about how one woman's greed and entitlement led to her spectacular downfall, and how sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone hang themselves with their own rope. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who thought they were above the law? Because after what happened to Karen, I guarantee you'll think twice before messing with someone's personal property. This is going to be one hell of a story. It all started about 3 weeks before the yard sale incident, when I received a notice from the HOA stating that my backyard shed was in violation of some obscure architectural guideline that I'd never heard of before. The notice, signed by Karen Mitchell in her flowing, pretentious handwriting, claimed that my shed was an eyesore and needed to be removed within 30 days or face daily fines of $50. Now, this shed had been there when I bought the house, and the previous owner had assured me it was fully compliant with all HOA regulations. I'd even seen the original approval documents during the home inspection. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I went to Karen's house to discuss the matter like adults. Big mistake. Karen answered the door in her typical outfit, a velour tracksuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, her blonde hair teased up to heaven, and that condescending smile that made my skin crawl. When I explained the situation and showed her the original approval documents, she barely glanced at them before dismissing me with a wave of her manicured hand. "Those old approvals don't matter anymore," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We have new standards now, and your little storage shack simply doesn't meet them. You have 30 days, Mr. Brown, and I suggest you use them wisely." I tried to reason with her, explaining that the shed contained thousands of dollars worth of tools, equipment, and personal items that I needed for my work and hobbies. Her response was to threaten me with legal action if I didn't comply. Over the next few days, I did my research. I pulled up the original HOA bylaws, the architectural guidelines, and every piece of documentation related to my property. What I discovered was interesting. There had been no official vote to change the architectural standards, and according to the HOA's own governing documents, any changes to existing approved structures required a majority vote from the Homeowners Association. Karen had essentially made up new rules on her own authority. I also discovered something else during my investigation. Karen had been using her position as HOA president to line her own pockets. She'd been awarding landscaping and maintenance contracts to companies owned by her relatives, charging the HOA inflated prices, and pocketing the difference. But I needed more evidence before I could act on that information. Meanwhile, the harassment from Karen escalated. She started driving by my house multiple times a day, taking photos of my shed from different angles. She sent me increasingly threatening letters, each one more legal sounding than the last. She even had the nerve to post on the neighborhood Facebook page about certain residents who think they're above the rules, complete with thinly veiled references to my address. The woman was clearly obsessed, but I had a feeling her obsession was going to be her downfall. What Karen didn't realize was that every letter she sent, every photo she took, every Facebook post she made was being carefully documented and stored in my personal digital archive. In my line of work, evidence is everything, and I was building quite a case. 2 weeks into this ordeal, I decided to take a different approach. Instead of continuing to engage with Karen directly, I started attending HOA board meetings and asking pointed questions about the decision-making process. At the first meeting I attended, I politely asked Karen to provide documentation showing when and how the architectural standards had been changed. She fumbled through some papers, clearly caught off guard, and promised to have the information at the next meeting. At the second meeting, she claimed the documents were being reviewed by legal counsel and would be available soon. By the third meeting, she was openly hostile, accusing me of disrupting the smooth operation of the association and threatening to have me banned from future meetings. But here's the thing about bullies. They hate being challenged in public, and Karen was starting to show her true colors in front of the other homeowners. I could see some of my neighbors beginning to question her leadership style, especially when she started yelling at an elderly resident who dared to ask about the landscaping budget. That's when I knew I had her. During my cybersecurity work, I'd learned that the best way to deal with someone abusing their power is to let them keep digging their own grave while you carefully document every shovelful of dirt. Karen was doing exactly that, and I was more than happy to let her continue. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in late October. I'd been working late the night before on a particularly complex security audit for a client, so I didn't get up until around 10 a.m. As I was making my coffee, I heard voices and commotion coming from across the street. Looking out my kitchen window, I could see Karen Mitchell's driveway filled with tables, and there were several cars parked along the street. At first, I thought she was having a yard sale, which seemed perfectly normal, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, displayed prominently on one of her tables, was my vintage toolbox. The same toolbox that had been sitting in my shed just 2 days earlier when I'd gone in there to grab my leaf blower. I threw on some clothes and walked across the street, my mind racing. As I got closer, I could see more of my belongings scattered across Karen's tables. My cordless drill set, my collection of vintage hand tools that had belonged to my grandfather. Even some camping equipment that I'd stored in the back corner of the shed. Karen was standing near the cash box, chatting with a potential customer about the excellent condition of my grandfather's hand plane. When she saw me approaching, her face went pale for just a moment before that familiar, condescending smile returned. "Oh, hello, Raymond," she said sweetly, as if she wasn't literally selling my stolen property. "Having a little yard sale, I see. Find anything interesting?" I replied, my voice carefully controlled despite the rage building inside me. She had the audacity to shrug and say, "Just clearing out some old junk that was cluttering up the neighborhood." That's when I lost it. Not in a screaming, violent way, but in a cold, calculated way that probably scared her more than yelling would have. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of every single item that belonged to me, making sure to capture Karen in the background of several shots. I also started recording video, narrating exactly what I was seeing. "This is my toolbox," I said clearly into the phone's microphone. "Serial number 47829, which I can prove with purchase receipts. This is my grandfather's hand plane set, which has his initials carved into the handles. This is my camping equipment, including a tent with my name written on the stuff sack." Karen tried to grab my phone, claiming I was harassing her customers, but I stepped back and continued documenting. That's when she made the mistake that would ultimately destroy her. Instead of trying to de-escalate the situation or come up with some reasonable explanation, Karen pulled out her own phone and called 911. "I need police immediately," she said dramatically. "There's a man here harassing me and my customers, and I think he might be dangerous. He's taking pictures of people without permission and making threats." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman had stolen my property, was actively selling it, and now she was trying to have me arrested for documenting the theft. But I kept recording because I knew that her 911 call was going to be the best evidence I could possibly have. While we waited for the police to arrive, Karen continued trying to control the narrative. She told the few customers who were still browsing that I was a disgruntled neighbor with mental health issues, who was obsessed with her. She claimed that all the items on her tables had been donated by various neighbors and that she was selling them to raise money for community improvements. The lies just kept flowing, but I noticed that she was getting increasingly agitated as I continued calmly documenting everything with my phone. What Karen didn't know was that I'd been recording our entire conversation from the moment she called 911, and I had her on video claiming ownership of my stolen property. When Officer Stephen Flores arrived about 10 minutes later, Karen immediately launched into her victim act. She claimed that I'd been stalking and harassing her for weeks, that I'd threatened her, and that I was now disrupting a legitimate community fundraising event. She painted herself as a dedicated community leader who was just trying to make the neighborhood better while dealing with an unstable neighbor. Officer Flores listened patiently to her story, taking notes and nodding sympathetically. Then he turned to me and asked for my side of the story. I calmly explained the situation, showed him the photos and videos I'd taken, and provided him with documentation proving ownership of the items in question. I also mentioned that I had security cameras on my property that would show when and how my shed had been accessed. Officer Flores was thorough and professional. He examined several of the items I'd claimed, verified the serial numbers I'd provided, and even called his supervisor to discuss the unusual nature of the situation. Meanwhile, Karen was becoming increasingly agitated, demanding that he arrest me for harassment and trespassing. She kept insisting that the items were donated, but couldn't provide any documentation or explain how she'd obtained them. When Officer Flores asked her directly how she'd gained access to my shed to retrieve the donated items, she stumbled over her words and finally claimed that she'd found them abandoned on my property after I'd failed to properly secure my belongings. That's when I showed the officer the photos I'd taken of my shed just 2 days earlier, clearly showing the items in question stored inside the locked building. I also provided him with the security camera footage from my system, which showed Karen and 2 other people entering my backyard at night and removing items from my shed. The timestamp on the footage was from 3 days earlier, at 2:47 a.m. Officer Flores watched the footage on my phone, and I could see his expression change as he realized what he was dealing with. This wasn't a neighbor dispute or a case of mistaken ownership. This was straight-up burglary, and Karen had been caught red-handed. The moment Officer Flores finished watching the security footage, the entire dynamic of the situation changed. Karen's confident, victim-playing demeanor cracked like a broken mask. She started backpedaling frantically, claiming that she'd had permission to enter my property and that there had been some kind of misunderstanding about the items. But when the officer asked her to provide documentation of this alleged permission, she couldn't produce anything. Instead, she started getting angry, demanding to know why he was taking the word of a man over a respected community leader. She played the gender card, the authority card, and even tried to suggest that I'd somehow manipulated the security footage. Officer Flores wasn't buying any of it. He called for backup and began the process of documenting the crime scene. As we waited for additional officers to arrive, I provided him with a complete inventory of my stolen items, along with purchase receipts, photos, and serial numbers for everything I could identify. The evidence was overwhelming, and Karen's story was falling apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. What really sealed her fate was when Officer Flores asked to see the donation documentation that Karen claimed to have for all the items at her yard sale. Not only could she not provide any paperwork for my belongings, but she couldn't provide documentation for most of the other items either. It became clear that this wasn't Karen's first rodeo. She'd been systematically stealing from neighbors and selling their belongings under the guise of community fundraising. When the backup officers arrived, they began interviewing the customers who were still at the yard sale. Several of them recognized items that had gone missing from their own properties over the past few months. Mrs. Sarah Parker from 3 houses down identified her garden tools. Mr. Joshua Davis from the next street over spotted his missing bicycle pump. Even Karen's next-door neighbor, Carolyn Scott, recognized a decorative planter that had disappeared from her front porch weeks earlier. It was like watching dominoes fall as the scope of Karen's theft operation became clear. She'd been using her position as HOA president to gain access to people's properties under the pretense of inspections and compliance checks, then stealing items that she thought wouldn't be immediately missed. The yard sale was just her way of converting the stolen goods into cash. As more evidence piled up, Karen's attitude shifted from indignant victim to desperate criminal. She started claiming that everything was a big misunderstanding and that she was just trying to help the community. But the evidence spoke for itself, and Officer Flores had heard enough. At 11:47 a.m., exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes after she'd called 911 to have me arrested, Karen Mitchell was placed in handcuffs and charged with multiple counts of burglary, theft, and operating a criminal enterprise. The aftermath of Karen's arrest was swift and decisive. Within hours of her being taken away in the back of a police cruiser, word had spread throughout the entire neighborhood. The local news picked up the story, running a segment about the HOA president-turned-burglar that made Karen infamous throughout the city. But the real justice came from the community itself. An emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Tuesday, where Karen was unanimously voted out of her position as president. The new interim president, Michelle Morgan, immediately began reviewing all of Karen's decisions and financial transactions during her tenure. What they found was even more damaging than the theft charges. Karen had been embezzling HOA funds for months, awarding inflated contracts to shell companies she'd created, and using association money to pay for her personal expenses. The financial audit revealed that she'd stolen nearly $30,000 from the community fund. My shed violation notice was immediately rescinded, along with all the other frivolous citations Karen had issued to homeowners who'd crossed her. The new board also implemented strict oversight procedures to prevent future abuse of power. As for Karen herself, she was facing serious felony charges that could result in several years in prison. Her husband filed for divorce within a week of her arrest, and their house went up for sale shortly after. The woman who'd thought she was untouchable had lost everything in the span of a few days. But perhaps the most satisfying part of this whole ordeal was what happened during Karen's court hearing. I was called as a witness to testify about the theft of my property and the events leading up to her arrest. Karen's lawyer tried to paint me as a vindictive neighbor who'd set up an elaborate scheme to frame his client, but the evidence was too overwhelming to dismiss. When I played the recording of Karen calling 911 and claiming that I was dangerous while she was literally selling my stolen property, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge was not amused by Karen's attempt to manipulate the legal system, and he made that very clear during sentencing. Karen received 2 years in prison for the burglary charges, plus an additional year for the embezzlement, and she was ordered to pay full restitution to all her victims. The cherry on top was that she was also banned from serving in any HOA leadership position for the rest of her life. As I watched her being led away in shackles, I couldn't help but think about how different things might have been if she'd just been reasonable about my shed in the first place. Instead, her greed and sense of entitlement had cost her everything. The months following Karen's conviction brought a sense of peace to Willowbrook Estates that none of us had experienced since she'd taken over as HOA president. Michelle Morgan proved to be an excellent interim president, focusing on actual community improvements rather than petty power trips and personal enrichment. The new board implemented transparent financial reporting, required multiple approvals for any expenditures over $500, and established a formal appeals process for homeowners who felt they'd been unfairly cited for violations. My shed, which had started this whole mess, became something of a neighborhood landmark. People would walk by and point it out as the shed that brought down Karen Mitchell. I even got a few requests from neighbors asking for advice on how to deal with their own HOA problems in other communities. Word of my success in exposing Karen's criminal enterprise had spread beyond our neighborhood, and I found myself becoming something of an accidental expert on HOA corruption. I started documenting my experience in a blog post that went viral, reaching thousands of homeowners who were dealing with similar situations. The post included detailed advice on how to gather evidence, document harassment, and protect yourself from abuse of power by HOA officials. I received hundreds of messages from people thanking me for sharing my story and asking for help with their own situations. One of the most rewarding aspects of this whole experience was reconnecting with my neighbors. During Karen's reign of terror, people had been afraid to speak up or get involved, but after her downfall, the community spirit returned stronger than ever. We organized regular neighborhood barbecues, started a community garden project, and even established a neighborhood watch program. The contrast between life under Karen's dictatorship and life in our newly democratic community was striking. People were happier, more engaged, and actually proud to live in Willowbrook Estates again. I also learned some valuable lessons about standing up to bullies and the importance of documentation. My background in cybersecurity had given me the tools I needed to gather evidence and build a case, But the real key was staying calm and methodical in the face of Karen's increasingly erratic behavior. If I'd let her provoke me into losing my temper or responding emotionally, she might have been able to turn the situation around and paint me as the aggressor. Instead, by keeping detailed records and letting her hang herself with her own rope, I was able to expose her criminal behavior and protect not just myself, but the entire community. Looking back on this entire experience, I'm struck by how one person's unchecked power and greed can poison an entire community, and how quickly things can change when that person is finally held accountable. Karen Mitchell thought she was untouchable because she held a position of authority, but she forgot that authority comes with responsibility, and power without accountability always leads to corruption. Her downfall wasn't the result of some elaborate revenge scheme on my part. It was simply the natural consequence of her own criminal behavior catching up with her. The security footage, the stolen property, the financial irregularities, all of that existed because of choices Karen made, not because I manufactured evidence against her. I just happened to be in the right place with the right skills to document what was really happening. The most important lesson from this story is that bullies rely on their victims staying silent and isolated. Karen's power came from the fact that she was targeting people individually, making each person feel like they were the only one having problems with her leadership. But once the truth came out and people realized that everyone was dealing with the same issues, her power evaporated overnight. That's why it's so important to speak up when you see injustice, even if it seems like you're fighting a losing battle. Today, Willowbrook Estates is a thriving community where people actually want to live. Property values have increased, neighbor relationships have improved, and our HOA functions the way it was originally intended, as a democratically governed organization that serves the interests of homeowners rather than the ego of one power-hungry individual. I still work in cybersecurity, but I've also become something of an advocate for HOA reform and homeowner rights. I speak at community meetings, help neighbors document harassment cases, and maintain a website with resources for people dealing with corrupt HOA officials. It's not the career path I expected to take, but it's incredibly rewarding to help people stand up for themselves and protect their rights. Karen Mitchell is currently serving her sentence at the State Women's Correctional Facility, and according to public records, she won't be eligible for parole for another 18 months. Her house was eventually sold to a lovely young couple with 2 kids who are active participants in our community events. It's amazing how much better the neighborhood feels without that dark cloud of corruption and harassment hanging over everything. The ripple effects of exposing Karen's criminal enterprise extended far beyond our little community. The local district attorney's office used my case as a model for investigating other HOA corruption cases throughout the county. Apparently, Karen's scheme wasn't unique. There were several other HOA officials who had been using similar tactics to steal from their communities. My documentation methods and evidence-gathering techniques became part of a training program for investigators dealing with HOA fraud cases. I was even invited to speak at a conference for homeowner advocacy groups, where I shared my story and provided practical advice for people dealing with corrupt HOA officials. The response was overwhelming, with hundreds of attendees asking for copies of my documentation templates and evidence-gathering checklists. What started as a personal battle to protect my property rights had evolved into a broader movement to reform HOA governance and protect homeowners from abuse. I never expected to become an accidental activist, but sometimes life pushes you in directions you never imagined. The skills I developed in cybersecurity, attention to detail, systematic documentation, patience in building a case, turned out to be exactly what was needed to take down a corrupt official and protect an entire community. One of the most satisfying developments came about 6 months after Karen's conviction, when I received a call from the FBI's white-collar crime division. Apparently, Karen's case had caught their attention because it fit a pattern they'd been tracking across multiple states. HOA corruption had become a significant problem, with officials stealing millions of dollars from homeowners through various schemes. They wanted to interview me about Karen's methods and learn from the evidence-gathering techniques I'd used to expose her. It turned out that my security footage and financial documentation had helped them understand how these criminals operate and develop better strategies for catching them. The agent I spoke with told me that my case had become a textbook example of how proper evidence collection could make the difference between a successful prosecution and a case that falls apart in court. They even asked permission to use excerpts from my security footage and training materials for other investigators. Knowing that my experience was helping to catch other criminals and protect other communities made all the stress and harassment I'd endured worthwhile. As I sit here in my backyard, looking at the shed that started this whole adventure, I can't help but smile at the irony of it all. Karen Mitchell set out to destroy what she saw as an eyesore in her perfect neighborhood. But instead, she ended up destroying herself. The shed is still there, still serving its purpose, still fully compliant with all legitimate HOA regulations. But more importantly, it stands as a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can lead to the biggest victories. If I had simply given in to Karen's demands and torn down my shed, she would have continued her reign of terror indefinitely. Other neighbors would have suffered, more money would have been stolen, and our community would have remained under the thumb of a petty tyrant. Instead, by standing up for what was right and documenting everything along the way, I was able to expose a criminal enterprise and restore justice to our neighborhood. The lesson here isn't just about dealing with HOA corruption. It's about the importance of standing up to bullies wherever you find them. Whether it's a corrupt official, an abusive boss, or just someone who thinks they can push you around because they have a little bit of power, the principles are the same. Document everything. Stay calm and professional, and let them hang themselves with their own rope. For anyone dealing with a similar situation, my advice is simple. Don't let them intimidate you into silence, but also don't let them provoke you into doing something stupid. Bullies like Karen thrive on emotional reactions because it allows them to paint you as the problem. Instead, be methodical, be patient, and be thorough in your documentation. In today's world, everyone has access to recording devices, security cameras, and digital storage. Use these tools to protect yourself and build your case. And remember, brain up. You're probably not the only one being targeted. Reach out to your neighbors, compare notes, and build a coalition of people who are willing to stand up together. That's how real change happens, and that's how communities heal from the damage caused by corrupt leaders. Karen Mitchell learned the hard way that actions have consequences, and that sometimes the person you're trying to destroy has the skills and determination to fight back. I hope her story serves as a warning to other would-be tyrants and an inspiration to anyone who's ever felt powerless in the face of institutional corruption. Justice may be slow, but it's also inevitable when good people refuse to stay silent.